started, as Jay has already commented, this is a whopping chapter, okay? And how far we will get into it or through it is yet to be revealed to us, just like when Jesus is coming. So we'll see about that. Hey, if you haven't heard, those of you who know them, Pat Lucas died about 1 a.m. this morning. Her husband's name is Jerry. And so Gilbert was telling me that she was one of the torch runners here in East Tennessee for, I guess, the Atlanta Olympics when the torch came through. And so that was something that brought her much joy and joy to her family, that she was able to do that. Tanya Bushnell continues to make some progress. She is not solidly on her feet yet, but she is much better than where she was 3 weeks ago. So we celebrate that. All right, good. Thanks for being here today. And I watched y'all online last week. So I was present in spirit while not in body. Okay? Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for all of the ways that you are just blessing us, nurturing us, caring for us, showing us your love, sending your spirit to build us up, sending your spirit to correct us in times when we need to be brought back into obedience with you. So thank you. Thank you for your word. We confess that we don't always do well at being diligent in our study or sometimes even in its application. So for what you have to show us today, we pray that we'll have eyes and ears to see and hear. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so a lot going on here, and so let me just begin with a couple of the notes that you have from me there right at the very beginning. So chapter 24 is kind of what's called an apocalyptic chapter. The word apocalyptic means to reveal or to disclose. The book of Daniel in the Old Testament falls into the category of apocalyptic writing, and we'll look at least one section of Daniel, but certainly the best known section or the best known part of the Bible that's apocalyptic is the book of the Revelation. Some people look at this and study this and say that it's all about Jesus coming back at the end of history. Others look at it and so if Jesus is talking sometime around 30 A.D., that he is looking forward to around 70 A.D., and that it's about the events that are going to come in 70 A.D., which, depending on whether Mark is written or Matthew is written before 70, then it's still to happen, or if it's a late writing of Matthew, then it makes sense for those first hearers to understand how Jesus may have been talking about the events of 70 A.D., which is the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem by the Romans. And some people believe it's a combination of both, okay? So you get to decide for yourself whether or not you think it is just about the fall of Jerusalem or whether it's about Jesus coming back one day, and whether it is about both. So let's read the first. We're going to read the first big section of this, and the first big section is going to go through verse 28. That just kind of keeps it all together, okay? Or 22. Let's do it through 22. I'm reading New Living Translation. As Jesus was leaving the temple grounds, his disciples pointed out to him the various temple buildings, but he responded, "Do you see all these buildings? I tell you the truth. They will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives, which is across from the Temple Mount, and his disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world? So you've got multiple questions, 3 different questions that are asked there. Jesus told them, don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming I'm the Messiah. They'll deceive many. And you will hear of wars and threats of war, but don't panic. These things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world. But all this is only the first of the birth pangs, with more to come. And then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You'll be hated all over the world because you are my followers. And many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many. Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world, so that all nations will hear it, and then the end will come. The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration or desolation, standing in the holy place. Reader, pay attention. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person out on the deck of a roof must not go down into the house to pack. A person out in the field must not return even to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days. And pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be greater anguish than at any time since the world began. And it will never be so great again. In fact, unless that time of calamity is shortened, not a single person will survive, but it will be shortened for the sake of God's chosen ones. Kind of a little light reading today, isn't it? Okay. So it all begins with the architecture of the temple, and so that mount. So it's not a mountain in the way that we think of it, but that high elevation was basically leveled on the top over the years, and it became the place where the temple was built. Remember, there was Solomon's temple, okay? Then Solomon's temple was destroyed by all the conquering eastern groups. It was restored to some degree under Ezra and Nehemiah's leadership. It was destroyed again. And then when Herod came on the scene, Herod the Great, Herod starts to rebuild it. Now, just kind of generally, Herod's not a traditional Jew. Okay, I mean he's of another tribe, basically. But Herod is filthy rich. Okay, he cornered the trade because of the intersection of highways or roadways there of the spice market. Okay, and so pretty much all the spices, which would be the equivalent to technology in today, spices were what were needed and wanted and valued. And so he had the market on all of that, and he was absolutely filthy rich. It is downright mean and demented as well, but he was pretty rich. And so rebuilding the temple did 2 things. One of which is it put him in good graces with the Jewish people. It also became, he was one of the greatest builders in the world. He had multiple palaces, and he didn't do anything on the cheap. And so neither was the temple done on the cheap. One writer says that the building project that was the Jerusalem temple and its accompanying grounds was the greatest building project at that time in all of the world. Okay, so it was mighty impressive, and we've all seen some scale models of that, and so it is impressive. So it's a source of great pride. The architecture is. It's a source of great pride to the Jewish people. The destruction of the temple, though, the prophets had said at times, if y'all don't obey God, God's going to come in and just destroy all this. And so for Jesus to talk about the destruction of the temple did a couple of things depending on how you were interpreting it. And so for all those times that we're not sure how to interpret things, neither were they. And so at the very least, to talk about the destruction of the temple was going to be a sign of God's judgment. But the Jews also heard it as a sign that God was about to come as the Messiah and establish his rule. So on the one hand, you've got this scorched earth kind of thing that Jesus is saying may happen. But on the other hand, depending on who is doing the interpretation, for Jesus to say that means that this is right on the verge of the Messiah coming. A small group of Jews, they denounced the temple as being impure. They announced judgment on it or the establishment that ran it. And some groups believe that God was about to bring a new temple. Ooh, okay, so if a group of Jews thought that there's going to be a new temple, what does that sound like to you? Sounds like the Revelation, okay, when there's going to be a new Jerusalem and a new temple where Jesus is the center of. Most Jewish people believe that the temple was invincible. I mean, the thing is massive. It's built like a rock, okay, because it is. Today, those of you who have been to Israel, you've seen some of those stones that remain in the retaining wall. And some of them are up to 40 feet long, cut stones, okay? The sheer work of trying to get them in place would have been remarkable. But 40-foot long stones, I think they're like, so 40 feet long, 10 feet high, I forget what the width is. They weigh anywhere from 100 to 400 tons. You've got some smaller stones that fit in, and they only weigh a couple of tons. You've got surrounding, or part of the surrounding of the temple proper, you've got Solomon's colonnade. The whole length of the colonnade ran 1,500 feet. That's more than a quarter of a mile, okay? That is one long piece of architecture. Mm-hmm. There were 160 columns that extended for over 900 feet, okay? So that's a pretty remarkable place. And yet the temple is destroyed 40 years after Jesus spoke, when the Romans were trying to quash rebellion, and the Romans were known for taking no prisoners. That's also the time, if you remember the story of Masada, just about everybody in this room is old enough to remember the days of miniseries on television, okay? And so there was a miniseries called Masada. And that too is a remarkable place in Israel to go there and to hear the stories about. It was Herod the Great's palace. Okay, it wasn't just something else. It was Herod the Great's palace that a band of Jews took over and basically remained invincible for many years.
Can you still see the ramp they built?
Yeah, you can, and even on pictures, if you know what you're looking for, you can see the ramp that the Romans, over that long period of time, did earth moving in order to build a battering ram to break through the wall. So, yeah. The other amazing thing is there are cisterns. Herod built cisterns on top of that mountain. It wasn't a matter of them dying of thirst ever. There was enough water there in those cisterns, and today you can walk down into those cisterns. But the Romans successfully, when they managed to conquer Jerusalem, they just destructed everything, because if you want to disillusion a group of religious people, you take out their center of worship, you take out their temple. And so they very successfully did that. About 100 years ago, an interesting piece, there is, and Ray Vander Laan would talk about this, but there was a pinnacle, or there was a corner, and I forget which side of the temple it was on, not of the worship space itself, but of the wall, and it was where the trumpet would blow every morning and every evening at the time of sacrifice. And about 100 years ago, they found a stone where that trumpeter would have said, or stood, and it said the place of trumpeting. Okay, and so for all of these stones that have been pulled down, torn down, broken up, they found this one fragment that says the place of the trumpeter, and it fits that it's located right near that corner where that corner would have been, and there it's still there 1900 years later. Okay.
The Wailing Wall, that wasn't part of the,
Yeah, it was a part of the temple.
that didn't, it stood?
Yeah, it's a part of the foundation. It's a part of the foundation wall.
Oh.
So not a part of, again, of the, when I say temple proper, I'm referring to the sanctuary, okay, to the box, and so that's a lower part of that temple wall. The Wailing Wall is. So Zechariah 14 verse 4 had predicted that the Messiah, or at least if it's not the Messiah, it's two witnesses are going to stand here at the temple and establish the Messiah's kingdom. So when Jesus talks about returning, or when they ask him what will signal your return, that's where we get our word for that. The Greek word is parousia, or coming or appearing, and it's where we kind of get our whole idea of rapture, meaning Jesus' return. So Jesus' second coming would bring normal history to end and begin a new period of kingdom history. Jesus warns his disciples, don't be led astray by imposters. Okay, and so there's, even in the Gospels, there's at least one reference to somebody who led people astray as what's called a messianic pretender. As somebody who showed up on the scene, began to build some clout and some energy, and who had people that started to follow him. It's interesting. I found a reference that said that of all the places that Rome ruled during this era, the most rebellious group of people were the Jews in this area. Okay. So whatever it was that motivated them, and I think it was just a keen sense of self and of identity and of God being their king. Okay, they pushed back apparently more than any place else that Rome sought to govern, and all of that also plays in around what we call Holy Week, from Palm Sunday, beginning the Passover week, through the Passover, when tensions are just really high because there's so many people that are coming in to Jerusalem. So Jesus warns them not to be deceived by imposters, or even to be overwhelmed by the different catastrophes that they are going to be looking at. So a series of false prophets, miracle workers, would always call. I mean, if you're really hoping that somebody's going to show up and deliver you, and we jokingly sometimes refer to people as having a Messiah complex. But if you've got this hope that's been ingrained in you for hundreds of years, that there's going to be a deliverer who's going to come, a Joshua, a Yeshua, who is going to come and save you, you are on the lookout for that person. But if you're not careful, you'll be deceived. Okay, and so that's what Jesus' concern is here. So there were those around Jesus' time and afterwards that were persuasive. But there's one in particular that stands out around 100 years after Jesus, and he directly claimed to be the Messiah. His name was Bar Kokhba, Chokbah, which would mean he was the son of Chokbah. So it's not clear whether Jesus is referring only to imposters in the period prior to the destruction of the temple, or is he referring to false messiahs throughout the church age, or a future tribulation that's coming. We have a way of projecting and looking at everything way into the future, and sometimes we miss what's really, really present. Okay, so, because sometimes it's not about the future. I mean, it's about the present, or it's about things that have already happened, that happened in that era, and so we start looking for things that may not be there. He talks about sufferings. Sometimes sufferings are referred to as birth pangs. He mentions earthquakes, false prophets, and the like. And apparently some of those happened pre-AD 70, and some of them continued and have continued to happen since AD 70. It looks like tumultuous times are just a part of how God's sovereign plan comes about. If you think about the Old Testament prophets and the tumultuous times that they spoke of, we shouldn't be so surprised that Jesus talks about it as well. And again, so the end could refer to something huge like AD 70, or maybe, in fact, it is still to come at the end of history as we know it when Jesus comes back again. Jesus indicates that there's going to be some pretty intense anguish that's going to be associated with it. At the end of the first century, the Roman historian Tacitus described Christians as the hated ones of humankind. Okay, and so that's still to come. Okay, because there are no Christians when Jesus speaks this. Okay, there's Jesus followers, there's Jews that are following Jesus, but the church hasn't yet been established when Jesus speaks it. However, the church is fairly well established by the time that Matthew writes and tells about this. And so as he's writing and talking about this, then the Jewish Christians may be doing some of their own interpretation based on their understanding of the prophets, and the Gentile Christians who are not familiar with Jewish writings are taking all of this just quite literally in their present. Persecution is going to come, and it will lead some to abandon their loyalty to Jesus. And that's been true in every age where the church has been faced with persecution. We know that in the Old Testament, and this is note 11, the Old Testament frequently mentions false prophets. False prophets claim to receive messages from God, but usually some of those false prophets, particularly modern ones, preach a health and wealth message. Those of you who use a Life Application Bible, that's a note directly out of that. They say what the people want to hear, even when the nation's not following God as it should. Jesus said there's going to be some false prophets. There's going to be some false teachers that are going to come, and he warns his followers, as he warns us, not to listen to their dangerous words. And again, you know, if you're full of anticipation and expectation about when the Messiah is going to come, or in our Christian context, you know, every now and again we go through these cycles of there being lots of apocalyptic talk about Jesus is coming soon, because this is another sign that says that he's coming soon. And people become so intense on looking for the signs that sometimes we interpret things because we're desperate to interpret them in that line. So those of you who've been with me most of my 7 years here, one of my stories is, as a teenager, back in the day when we only had 3 channels and they went off at 11 o'clock or at midnight. There was a TV evangelist, and he was he was kind of also in that era of Hal Lindsey and the late great Planet Earth and all of that. But this TV evangelist, he was the first one that I ever heard, and he got some airtime about 8 o'clock on one of the network channels. He and his wife did. And I was just absolutely fascinated. Oh man, I was just sucked in. I drank the Kool-Aid. Okay, so
Van Impe?
huh?
Van Impe?
How did you know?
I used to watch him.
Yeah. So send me money, and I'll send you a lapel pin that says "Perhaps Today." Okay, I've still got the lapel pin. Okay, I have kept that as a reminder of a season in my life. Okay, I have hung on to that pin as a reminder, and so there was his season, and then the next kind of season had to do with the people that I ran with. And so in the early 80s, you remember Africa and Muammar Gaddafi and talk of Gog and Magog? All right, and so I started to get drawn into that a little bit. And then a few years later, I got to watch Jack and Rexella Van Impe again on television. And guess what? I was smart enough to remember that what they said was about to happen back in the late 70s and what they were saying it was going to happen now in the 1980s were two different things. Same passage of Scripture and two different things. And so that was the first time that I really started to question how careful we have to be with biblical prophecy, okay, and how we hold that. I think they're both still living, okay. I knew some folks who knew them personally at one point, and I know up until about a decade ago you could still find them on some cable shows. So I say all of that to say that while I think it's always important for us as the church and the body of Christ to be looking toward the day of Jesus coming and to be ready for that day, we have to major on the majors and minor on the minors, okay? And to me, the majors is continuing to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves, okay? And to be obedient to the Scripture that we know, but to not get into all the predictions, because that just becomes really distracting, and I think it makes us really, really vulnerable. So I'm being very transparent about my own experience around that. So so in verse 12 there, he talks about how sin will be rampant, how the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. If the love within the community of Jesus followers diminishes to the point of extinction, then the community ceases to be what it was designed to be. Okay? And so with false teachers, with loose morals, comes a particularly destructive disease, and that's the loss of love for God and the loss of love for others. Jesus says, though, that those who endure to the end, who maintain faithful allegiance to Jesus, despite persecution, then they will be rewarded. So here the end may refer to the end of our own lives, and the judgment on Israel in AD 70 or at the very end of history. So I am, 1991, so I am 30 years old. It's a Saturday morning. Joy and I had just started dating. I'm not married yet. I'm moving to Etowah, Tennessee, to my new church. I'm backing a U-Haul truck into the driveway to start unloading the goods that I have into the parsonage there. And there is a woman, she is determined that she's going to be the first person to speak to the new preacher. I mean, you can just tell that she has a singular agenda. And so, it's like I'm backing the truck up and back trying to get it centered, and she's moving with me. I mean, she's just waiting for that thing to stop so that she can speak to me. And so I stopped the truck, I opened the door, and immediately she introduces herself and she says to me, "I believe Jesus is coming back soon. Don't you believe it?" And I thought, this is a test. This is only a test, okay? And so that's exactly what I thought. And so my response to her that day, as it would be many times in the coming 5 years, was, it is sooner today than it was yesterday, okay? And so she would often through the years say to me, don't you believe Jesus is coming back soon? Don't you believe that this is a sign? And my response always, and I grew to love Gladys. Gladys and I had some moments. But I grew to love Gladys, and I would just say, it's always sooner, and I'm much more interested in being ready when he comes than trying to predict when he comes. And I hope that you'll be the same. Prophecy's fascinating, okay? But because interpreters tend to shift the interpretation over a period of time while we're waiting on Jesus to come, you got to be careful. So I'll say it again. Just you have to be careful with it. So verse 14 in your notes, throughout the world anticipates that the Gentile mission is going to continue. Okay, Jesus said that it's going to happen: Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And we see it happening in the Acts of the Apostles just as soon as the Holy Spirit comes. There's going to be a delay prior to the end, however short or however long that delay is. Okay, we're still waiting. I mean, here we are. Jesus is coming soon. Okay, and here we are. We're still waiting. 1990 years since his ascension. We're still waiting. But the point is, we wait faithfully for him. And during that time, the good news continues to have to go out. And see, what happens is whenever we start navel gazing, y'all know what I mean, don't you? About picking land out of your navel. And so when we start navel gazing and trying to make sure that we get a sense of what this and this and this and prophecy means, and we forget our mission of being a light to the world and salt in this world as well, then we get distracted and we don't live into our mission. There's always going to be a place for our mission while we're seeking to live faithfully and obediently. But then Jesus in that section throws in something just, oh goodness, he throws in this thing about, and this goes into verse 15, because he says that the end will be signaled by a sacrilegious object, furious persecution, and finally the sign of the Son of Man. So what do you do with all of this sacrilegious object that causes desecration, the abomination of desolation, one translation says. And so there's been all kinds of attempts to clarify what that means. So what are some of them? Some folks have said it was a false priest who came to assume the priesthood, so somebody not in the priestly line. Some folks have said it was the presence of unlawful images of God or of humans, or certain humans themselves, like emperors who wanted their image installed in the temple because if it's a place of worship, by golly, I'm going to be the one who's being worshipped. There were some, like when Titus, who was emperor, he was the one who was responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem, and before the temple was completely destroyed, he made a sacrifice there that was probably pig sacrifice, okay? And you really want to tick off Jews, you sacrifice a pig, okay? And so an inappropriate sacrifice. And then there are some who felt like it was the presence of the Antichrist in the temple. He says, reader, pay attention. Okay, now that's interesting. I mean, a parenthetical note about reader, pay attention. That implies that Matthew's got a relationship with those that he's reading, or that's reading it. Okay, all right. So while it's going to be a letter that ultimately circulates into all the world. Okay, he's obviously got a specific audience in mind, and he maybe knows some of those people who are going to be hearing it or who are going to be reading it, and so maybe this is a bit of self-disclosure on his part that he knows them. I want to invite you just to hold that place in your Bible and turn back to Daniel. You don't have to go too far, okay? But turn back to Daniel. You remember Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, okay? So I do that to confirmation class, all right? So I try to help them find a place. So I just start telling them the books that are going to precede it. So let's just look real quick and get this image in our heads. Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. Daniel 9:27. So let's go back to verse 26. After this period of 62 sets of 7, the anointed one, which may be a king in Daniel's thinking, or it may be Jesus, or who knows, appearing to have accomplished nothing, and a ruler will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. The end will come with a flood, and war and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. The ruler will make a treaty with the people for a period of 1 set of 7, but after this time he'll put an end to the sacrifices and to the offerings, presumably in the temple, and as a climax to all his terrible deeds, he will set up a sacrilegious object that causes desecration until the fate decreed for this defiler is finally poured out on him. Okay, so just want to show you that some of the language that Jesus is using really is very similar to what Daniel talks about. Turn over to verse 30 of chapter 11. Go to chapter 11, and let's look at verse 30 and 31. Chapter 11, verse 30. For warships from western coastlands will scare him off, and then he will withdraw and return home, but he will vent his anger against the people, that is the Jews, of the Holy Covenant, and reward those who forsake the covenant. Those of you who did Daniel with me during the pandemic, you may remember some of this. His army will take over the temple fortress, pollute the sanctuary, put a stop to the daily sacrifices, and set up the sacrilegious object that causes desecration. And he will win over and he will flatter those who violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will be strong and will resist him. And really the whole chapter, the whole of verse 12, or chapter 12 fits into this as well. But if you look at chapter 12, verse 11, it says, from the time the daily sacrifice is stopped and the sacrilegious object that causes desecration is set up to be worshipped, there will be 1,290 days, 3.5 years, and blessed are those who wait and remain until the end of 1,335 days. Wow. Okay. So, is Jesus referencing something that's already happened, or is he referencing something that's still to come? So, a little bit further background information. It really looks like he's drawing upon an image from the book of Daniel. And Daniel's prediction, on some level, came true in 168 BC. That's when the Greeks take over Judea, pre-Roman period. And so the Greeks are in control, and there is a Greek ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, and he sacrificed a pig to Zeus on the temple altar, and so Jesus' words would have been remembered at the destruction of the temple in AD 90, then when Titus places an idol on the site of the temple. And if you go and you look in 2 Thessalonians and the Revelation, then you see that there's one that is predicted to arise that will set up an image of himself and order everyone to worship him. Throughout Israel's history, when you look at their history, whenever the people persisted in disobedience, God allows their fall. God allows their desolation. The destruction of the temple in AD 70 is just one, but if you go back to earlier times than the destruction of the temple by ultimately the Babylonians is there too. The first century historian Josephus believed that the abomination was when Jewish nationalists slaughtered the priest in the temple. Okay, now that was part of what set off Rome coming down so hard on them. But they felt like the priests were in cahoots with the Romans and were not authentic priests, and so there was just a slaughter. Josephus, it's interesting. Josephus gives us all this information. He even talks about John the Baptizer, but he never mentions Jesus. Okay, for whatever his reason was, his history, and he writes of the period, but it's sanitized where Jesus is concerned. No mention of Jesus. Josephus believed the desolation was the temple's destruction 3.5 years after the slaughter of the priest. So at that time, the side of the temple, Roman soldiers, on the side of the temple, Roman soldiers worshipped the image of Titus Caesar that they carried on their standards. And of course, that again, for any of the Jews that remained, would have been idolatry. Let's go just a little bit further. Whenever there is a warring group or a threatening group, you would typically flee to the city, okay? Because it was the city's, a walled city, it was the city's job, and it was the king's job to protect the citizenry, not only those who lived within the walls of the city, but for all the daughter villages that are outside. And so the king is responsible for all the daughters, for all the villages out here. And so typically you would want to go to the city because that's going to be the safest place. But Jesus said, not going to be a safe place in this scenario. You flee. You just get out and go to the mountains. I mean, that's what David did when he was fleeing from Saul, and to some degree when he was fleeing from Absalom. And also that Maccabean revolt that was pushed back against Antiochus Epiphanes. People fled not into the city but out of the city. Rooftops, good place for gathering, but Jesus says don't even go downstairs to pack. Okay, usually you wouldn't get to the top from inside. There's a downstairs staircase. So when all this starts to happen, just head down the stairs and get out of town as quick as you can. Once Jerusalem fell into the hands of Jewish revolutionaries, it was difficult for anyone still in the city to escape. Later in 1868, even those who did escape could no longer flee safely to the Romans because the Romans are there. He talks in verse 18, interesting reference there. Don't even go back to get your coat. If you're in the field, don't go get back to get your coat. We all know what it means to layer our clothes. Okay, so if you start out early in the morning and it's cool, by later in the day you're going to need less clothes. Just leave it laying there. Just start running. Get out of town, and that's significant because that coat would have also been your blanket. Interesting piece. That's the one thing that you can't take somebody's cloak overnight. If they give it to you as surety for a debt, you've got to give it back to them, the Old Testament says. Josephus documented that during the siege of Jerusalem, some women even ate their children. Okay, all right, so the Romans always felt like they could outlast anybody. Okay, and that's why, and if you remember the end of the story of Masada, okay, they broke into Masada expecting to take all the survivors that had been holed up there for years. They expected to take them and torture them and make them an example, and they all had killed themselves. Supposedly one person survived and managed to get out. But that Rome, they figured they'll starve you out. And so that's part of what was going on there. Josephus records, because he talks there also about pray that your flight's in the winter, and the winters when there are rains, or on the Sabbath, because you're not supposed to travel on the Sabbath. Okay. So, hey, you're about to be killed. So, do you just sit down, or do you on the Sabbath, or do you flee, which you're not supposed to do because you'd be breaking the Sabbath? Okay. And so some groups learned that Jews wouldn't flee on the Sabbath, and so that's when they would always attack them, because they knew they would just sit down and let them kill them. The last note there, Daniel 12:1, I didn't read it, spoke of a final tribulation greater than any that preceded it. Matthew expected history to continue even after the temple's destruction, so that's obvious. Josephus documented the savagery of time because people were just absolutely desperate. And God's chosen ones endure, they remain faithful. The fact that he uses the phrase to be cut short or shortened might mean that the period of tribulation would not last the full number of days that it was expected to last. And so you remember seeing back there in Daniel, there was the first number, and then there was the second number. All right, so Jesus tells us all of this, and it starts out innocuous enough because they're there for the Passover, okay? And so sometimes it seems like the disciples haven't gotten out much, okay, because they're just kind of in awe of the buildings. John records that Jesus went to 3 different Passovers, but in Matthew it almost seems like Jesus and the disciples have never been to Jerusalem. And they get into this series of questions. When's all of this going to happen? When's the temple going to be torn down? What sign will signal your return, and what sign will signal the end of the world? And so Jesus just gives them this explanation about that. Again, he's talking pre-Christian. Matthew's writing in a Christian era. Your thoughts or observations when you read all this? And so it looks like we're not going to finish this chapter.
Jewish nationalist. Did they have a name? Was it the Essenes or?
They were generally referred to as zealots.
Zealots.
Okay, and the Galilee area was just a real hotbed for zealots, and so whenever there's reference to the 10 towns or the Decapolis, there's part of that area in which there's just all of this tension that exists between the Romans and the Jews, because the Jews want to be free of them. And they're still inspired somewhat. I'm assuming they're still inspired by the Maccabean revolt in the late 2nd century that got all the Greeks out. But the Romans replaced it.
But it was Maccabees. That's
No.
So the Decapolis, was that the Jews or Gentiles that lived in the 10 cities?
So it's Gentiles, okay, but there's areas around that there's there's Jewish towns or populations in that area. Wow. Okay. Just a lot, huh? Yeah. It's just a lot. So this is one of those times when we think about apocalyptic writing either being in a place like Daniel or being in the Revelation. Here you get a taste of Jesus himself talking about what is to be. And so is it strictly what is to be around 70 AD, or is it what is to be when he comes back again? Or is it both? And I'll start to say, I think it's both. All right, Paul?
Where it talks about unequaled from the beginning of the world until now and never to be equaled again, I think that's definitely the revelation, the end times, for sure. It's a reference to that. And then the abomination that causes desolation, In my Bible, it says, it talks about in the holy place, it's not necessarily mentions the temple. So holy place and temple could be synonymous with.
I would
every-
say it's
All
synonymous.
church, yes, yeah.
I would say
The
it
Christ Church all over the world.
could be, but it also could be talking specifically in that piece just about the temple in about 70 AD. Okay, about the destruction of the temple. So I don't think all of it is about 70 AD, but I don't think all of it is also about what is yet to be. I think it's both and not either or. You tracking with me?
Yeah, it seems like everything that happened in the Old Testament up to the time that Jesus came and until he was executed is in a way perfectly analogous to everything that's happening throughout the world throughout all of time. And so it's a story within a story that's even larger, which is happening. That's the way I interpret it.
So every age has interpreted in light of their age. Okay? And so think about what was going on in Europe in the late 1500s or early 1600s. And I'm not talking about the Crusades. I'm talking about something else that was going on, and people in the church in that time thought that this is
Black Death.
exactly the bubonic plague and the Black Death. They saw that period as surely Jesus is about to come back, okay, just because of how severe it is. There's the whole piece around not knowing when it's going to happen, or people not being prepared when it happens. I've always said that means one of two things. It means times are going to be so good nobody's thinking about God, or times are going to be so bad that nobody's thinking about God. Okay?
You know, it's kind of interesting with the world events today. It doesn't seem like the Christian church as a whole is publicizing gloom and doom like they've done in the past. You know, like when you looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis, it kind of started a Jesus movement out of fear of the world ending. So people started writing books and making movies, and all kinds of new Christian groups came trying to get people to open their eyes.
Yeah?
And I'm not seeing, maybe I'm missing some of it, but I'm not seeing them doing the same on this kind of plane that we're having now, with all the rumors of wars and what could be happening.
So I think that's because we're less Christianized.
Right. I mean, if you were in Ukraine now and a Christian, you would probably be like, could this be, and talking to your neighbors, and you better be ready. But we've become so, like you said, de-Christianized now that it's not on the forefront.
Well, I think that's the ultimate message that's in all this, is nothing we can do that is taught to us, nothing we have any control over, except ourselves. We have control over the people in this room, and nothing else. We can be prepared.
So and navel gazing, as I call it, okay, trying to predict the signs, distracts us from our core mission, and the core mission continues to be sharing the good news about Jesus Christ with any and all who haven't heard it yet. Okay, yeah.
You know, after World War II, I can remember we had a lot of guests in our house, and they were talking about prophecy, and you just heard a lot about it. And I, as a child, was thinking, gee, the end could come any time. But I mean, and there was this one time when on a Sunday afternoon, everything went black, and people thought, sure, it was the second coming, and they were bowing in the streets. But at that time, you know, the church was in these small towns. The small town I grew up in, the church was primary,
Yeah.
and that's not true so much today.
Yeah, we worked off of a common knowledge
Mhm.
that's not common anymore. Okay, and that was an understanding of the scriptures. It wasn't 100%, but it was enough to provide a common language. Yeah.
Well, don't kid yourself, though. These days are definitely different than anything we have ever seen. 150 years ago, we were shooting 58 caliber bullets, in the Civil War. Now you've got drones, you've got you've got enough nuclear warheads out there to make the Earth a crust 5 times over. And and plus then all this stuff we're doing with the with all the stem cells and the genetics and creating these, different, where we're gonna have body farms where we can, give our DNA and have somebody grow up to be 19 years old and then harvest all their parts and put them. God doesn't like that stuff. Doesn't like that.
And who knows how much longer we have. Okay.
The Bible says we need to be ready and we need to keep telling the message.
Exactly. But what the church in some places and times has done is when the signs have looked so much like this is it, the church drew inside rather than staying outside. Okay? It drew inside and talked about this is it. This is what the signs are. This is what the signs mean. And then it passes. And the church is embarrassed when that, and I'm talking capital C, the church becomes embarrassed. And it has missed that period of being engaged with the world and with the message because it became disengaged with the world. Okay?
No, it talks about in the last days there will be a wicked generation. If it gets any more wicked than the ones now, I don't know.
I hear you. Okay.
Well, that's just.
And there are days that I'm truly, this country hasn't seen anarchy. Okay, we've not seen anarchy. We don't. We may have gotten a taste of it every now and again, but not like some other places.
And we haven't seen the first century AD either, when the church was a minority. And every generation thinks its generation is the worst. And we just have that kind of selfishness about us. We didn't grow up in the first century either.
But we're getting more like it. We're on our way. And so there's, in thinking about how we had this common language and how people responded to world events, where my mind went, just in thinking about that, is because we have this shift downward in common language. We have this shift downward in anxiety about whether or not this could be it, and where my mind went was, okay, does that mean that this is pruning? Okay, does that mean that it's pruning the church down to get it more like the first century? Okay, so yeah.
If I were to look at our country, it's almost like the days of Noah. Like we have a job to build an ark that's steadfast, headed in God's direction, and the rest of the world just acts like nothing bad is happening or that there's no calamity down the road, and you hope that someone jumps on the boat with you.
So, I don't know if any of you all are doing the read together, read the Bible through in a year. And so Monday was, I think it was Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6. I started reading it through, and all of a sudden I started realizing the repetition of the word obey. And God is saying, you're going to be my people, and you're going to live the life that I promised you in my covenant that you'll live. You've got to obey. And so I started back at the beginning, and I just started circling. Those of you who have seen any of my Bibles, it's just a work of stuff. And so I just went back through and just started circling the word obey, 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 over and over and over again. Because God knew that was essential to the covenant. We don't like the word obey.
we rely so much on the signs, and there have always been wars, there have always been famines, there's always been diseases, there have always been these things. And at that time, they would have said, this is another sign. And we rely so much on it because we think we will have an opportunity. But we're told that when the end does come, it'll be a cataclysmic thing, it will happen instantaneously. And there will be signs leading up to it, but there were signs before. And that's the worst thing, to get you to not paying attention when you get followed. Like if we keep hearing somebody cry wolf, and they cry wolf, and they cry wolf, and then you get to the place you don't pay attention when somebody cries wolf.
I had trouble when my father passed away. I was the family member that was with him, over Park West Hospital. And over the 5 years before he died, he kept, you'd hear him say a lot of things. Well, I'm gonna die tomorrow, I'm gonna die tonight, I've got heart, I can feel my heart, I'm gonna be dead tomorrow. After you hear that 50, 100 times, but when he passed away, I looked at the nurse and, I said, you're kidding. She said, your dad's gone. I said,
You didn't think it was gonna happen. You didn't think it was.
I mean, she said, why are you reacting that? Why are you, like, I told you, his heart's not beating, he's not, there's no respiration, I mean, he's gone.
So, where this has gone here right now, makes me just really aware, because there have been all kinds of Christian-based groups through the years who have withdrawn. They pulled inside because because of how bad the world was, and because they thought it was a sign that Jesus was coming. And again, when we pull inside, we cease to be outside in our witness. So when we pull inside, and then because it doesn't happen, and we go back outside, we've lost credibility. So I guess the thought that because I was trying to think, how do I end this? What do I leave us with? And I guess the thought that I would just send you home to ponder on is, what does it mean to be a body that looks at the scriptures, whether you're talking about Jesus' words here, or whether you're talking about the Revelation? What does it mean to be a body who looks at this and who says, I see the signs, okay? I believe these are pointing us more and more toward Jesus. And to not spend too much time trying to sort through the meaning of the signs, but in order to be credible, to still be present with, for, and to the world around us, okay? How is it that we continue to be present in the midst of the signs to the world around us? See, I think that, and I don't know, Alan, you might have some sense about first century after the Revelation was written. And I think Paul warned them about the tension in his own writings about withdrawing versus being present to the world as a light. How do you keep being present? How do you keep being present? So I'd ask you to think about that.
I think so much about Ukraine and the atrocities that is happening with them, and I know that we've helped financially and with some things. But we have more responsibility than that. We watched thousands, millions of Jews being killed every day. It took us a long time to ever get in there to do anything. And this is a lot the same thing when they're tying up children's hands and shooting them and putting them in a grave with their parents. I mean, how can we just read that every day and then get up and go on about our business? How do we do that best?
I have a good word for you.
Last thing, I'll be quiet now. It seemed to me that signs are for unbelievers. Believers don't need signs.
Boy, we sure like to play with them though, don't we?
But it's,
So who do you think buys all those books about end times?
Christians.
Exactly. Exactly. We're a big market,
And there's a lot of them out there now.
and there's a lot of them out there.
Is Hubbard, is he the same guy that, what's that religion?
I know what you're talking about, and I don't remember.
Scientology.
Scientology. Is he behind that, or is that's a different deal?
Don't know.
I don't either.
I don't know the answer to that one. All right, folks, we'll pick up next week with what, verse 23? Okay, so thank you. It's kind of a different class, wasn't it? Okay, it's just kind of different, but I hope it's thoughtful for you.
The good news is,
The good news?
in this passage, Jesus' audience was the disciples. And obviously, they took his message of today and decided not to turn in, but to go out and spread the good news so that we could get it.
Amen.
So we just need to be disciples.
Amen.
There you go. Good.
Open doors,
That's the
open
challenge.
hearts. What was that Methodist church?
That sounds-
You remember the open,
I do.
open door,
Yeah. I still-
Open minds,
open mind.
open hearts.
Minds and
Open
doors.
minds and open
I
doors.
I remember one of my senior colleagues who said, I guarantee you that was your come back something.
He's gonna bite.
And it has.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah.
It has.
We just don't, open doors are not open.
Okay. Real scoop is in there sometimes. Any questions about the timeline? Yeah, it's all.
See you morning.
I know what I have to do.
Charts you're trying
I'll tell you.
to. It's a Bible here. She had the PowerPoint presentation. And I have it on my PC, she doesn't have it on the Mac.
Yep, oh, yeah.
Put it together, and then she had to take my PC with her, and now she's trying to figure out how to flash it. And get the stuff and hook it up to the projector. And, well, that's like the animal clickers, you get advanced 45s and all this stuff.
She doesn't get into a smart TV.
Seen it.
Well, they,
I don't know what she hooked it into.
Very good.
I could do that. Well, if she's gonna keep doing this, I'm gonna do that.
I never understood the one, I
Yeah,
forget
you
which
gotta
one it was.
find the older ones that don't require the
Crusade.
subscription.
Oh, yeah.
Took out big.
Microsoft is trying to do everything with subscription.
And when they would come across
Pay
the
everybody.
community of Jews,
And I got one of the last
I thought you
versions.
guys were headed for the Holy Land. It's saying, what are you
Where
doing?
you get it and you can keep it forever, and
Yeah. and-
Just bloodthirsty.
you don't get any updates, but it does everything all in one.
I haven't told
You
you.
can still find them somewhere.
When I went
Oh,
to
yeah.
Israel with RBL,
There are people.
I have to
I'm
do
sold
something sometimes
with
because
the
I
intention of
what I
bringing
call
home a
head
souvenir.
brushes.
Techie enough.
And I knew what I
And all of a
wanted.
sudden it's just like you're.
And I was willing to
like
pay
this.
Looking now for it. I think they
I
make the new
wanted,
systems, you know, where they break down.
Crusader Cross.
Yeah, I've heard.
I've been afraid to change them.
Well, and I changed my mind because he said that you were a Muslim, but you could
I changed it about
cross,
a year ago now.
Crusader Cross.
It's that first couple weeks.
It's a little bit different.
Oh, really?
The
Because
bottom of the
Whenever you
screen
switch
looks a little bit
simple
different.
and
I always pray for the second
Oh,
coming
really?
when I get
You
it.
made it like.
It's like, God save me
I
from
didn't come
this.
home with me.
Yeah. That's the reason I switched to Mac when I came out with Windows 8, I believe it was. I thought,
You might want to turn that off.
a whole new operating
Can you turn it
system.
off?
And if I do, then I'm gonna go to a Mac.
You go up there and get some soup. Do they have?
Yeah, I bought
what's in
Oh, I
the
don't know.
back.
I think it's on.
I know there's chili.
Yeah, if you can't see anything.
Well, I can still see it.
I've all,
Let me look at
I
it.
use Max many, many
It's a
years ago,
difficult
especially
thing to
when I
turn
was
off.
Have you ever been to
in the office there in DC, but
corner market?
it only gets 60 on.
It's still on. Oh, is that it?
Yeah, I think that's it.
So I got her Mac, and I
Yeah.
got the, I forget what it was.
Gas station.
So,
No. It'll shut off at some point.
$50 a year, you know, they would answer anything you wanted to do, and she could actually
you have to,
go into the Mac store, the Genius Bar, and,
well,
and
darn.
once a
I
month,
turned it off before.
go in, and they would spend a half an hour with her and show her how to do whatever she wanted to do. So that's what she